When you hear the name Rockefeller, an image of ultimate power and wealth likely comes to mind. But beneath the polished surface of order and success lies a truth they fought to bury. Forget the gilded skyscrapers and charitable endowments for a moment, because behind the myth lies a shocking saga of blood, scandal, and devastating tragedy that the Rockefellers fought desperately to conceal. This isn't just a story about a rich family. It's about a name that became a curse, a name so powerful it seemed destined to break the very people who carried it. Prepare to have everything you thought you knew about the Rockefellers ripped apart. We're diving deep into the secrets they buried for over a century. The founder's sinister conman father, a bigamist and alleged rapist on the run, the brutal massacre of innocent women and children, a stain they tried to scrub from history with their billions, the heir who vanished into the New Guinea jungle, with chilling rumors of cannibalism swirling around his disappearance, a vice president's scandalous death in the arms of a young lover, and the string of mysterious suicides that revealed the hidden psychological torment haunting this seemingly invincible dynasty. This is the Rockefeller story they never wanted you to see. Get ready for a truth far more gripping than any legend. The founder's secret, a conman's son in a gilded prison. Every empire has its creation myth, and the Rockefellers is no exception. But before there was John D. Rockefeller Sr., the living saint of capitalism and piety, there was his father, a figure the dynasty poured its energy and fortune into erasing from history. He was William Avery Rockefeller, but to those who knew his true nature, he went by another name, Devil Bill. He was the family's first great shame, a figure of such chaos that the entire Rockefeller dynasty was built as a direct reaction against him. Devil Bill was no industrialist. He was a professional con artist, a master of deceit. He was tall and handsome with a charm so mesmerizing it was practically a weapon. With it, he roamed the American countryside in the 19th century, peddling homemade miracle cures and snake oil that promised to cure all ailments. He called himself Dr. Bill Livingston, a botanic physician, but he was merely a drifter who lived by swindling gullible townsfolk. He could arrive in a town penniless and leave with a horse and a pocket full of cash. But selling fake medicine was the least of his crimes. Devil Bill's life was a tangled web of lies and immorality. He was, quite literally, a bigamist. In 1837, he married the devout and long-suffering Eliza Davison, who would become the mother of John D. Rockefeller Sr. But his long business trips were actually escapes from responsibility and the law. In the 1850s, while still married to Eliza, Devil Bill took a second wife, Margaret Allen, under an alias. He maintained this bigamous life for years, fathering children with both women and constantly moving to avoid being discovered. His crimes went even further than fraud and bigamy. The darkest stain on Devil Bill's life was a rape accusation in Cayuga County, New York, in 1849. A woman working as a housekeeper in his home accused him of assaulting her. An indictment was issued, and Devil Bill was forced to flee, beginning a life on the run, constantly changing his identity to evade justice. He was never convicted, but the rumor and the warrant became his constant companions, forcing him to live the rest of his life as an outlaw. The existence of Devil Bill was an unforgivable humiliation for his son, John D. Rockefeller Sr. While John D. built a flawless public image, a devout Baptist, a disciplined businessman, a generous philanthropist, he lived in constant fear that his father's sordid past would be exposed. John D. did everything in his power to erase Devil Bill from the family story. He rarely spoke of his father, and if he did, it was only in vague terms. He paid money to stop an unflattering biography of his father from being published. He built a fortress of respectability and morality around himself, and that wall was built not just to display success, but to hide the shame of his origins. The shadow of Devil Bill profoundly shaped John D. Rockefeller Sr., John D. S. obsession with order, discipline, and control can be seen as a direct psychological reaction to his father's chaos, irresponsibility, and immorality. He wasn't just building Standard Oil. He was building an orderly, predictable world, a world completely opposite to the drifting, deceptive life of Devil Bill. The irony is that without the devil for a father, the world may never have gotten its saint of capitalism. This original scandal became the invisible engine behind the creation of one of history's greatest empires. This brings us to the first great tragedy of the dynasty, the tragedy of what happens when a man achieves everything he ever wanted. John Davison Rockefeller Sr. conquered the world, only to find himself a prisoner in it. The first half of John D.'s life was a relentless, brutal ascent. He was a predator in the world of business, crushing competitors with a calculated ruthlessness that earned him the title of the most hated man in America. The Cleveland Massacre was not just a business strategy, it was a campaign of economic warfare. He believed his mission was ordained by God. In his mind, this divine certainty wasn't just permission, it was a command to operate without mercy. But as his wealth grew to unimaginable levels, it began to transform him in strange and terrible ways. He became a prisoner of his own fortune. He couldn't walk the streets without being accosted, cursed, or begged for money. He received thousands of letters a day, many of them death threats. He had to hire bodyguards, not just for his safety, but to shield him from the sheer weight of the world's desperation and animosity. Political cartoons depicted him as a monstrous octopus, its tentacles strangling the globe. The man who could control 90% of the world's oil could not enjoy a simple walk in the park. His estates, like Kikwit in Pocantico Hills, became gilded fortresses, surrounded by walls and guards. He created a world of perfect order, but it was an empty one, isolated from the very people he had spent his life trying to conquer. He famously remarked, "I don't know of anything that is so desirable as a government bond or a good mortgage." It was the confession of a man who had lost his ability to find joy in anything that wasn't quantifiable and safe. His relationships suffered under this immense pressure. He was famously distant with his children, treating his family with the same detached efficiency he applied to his business. He would review household expenses line by line, rewarding his children with dimes for small chores or for catching flies, attempting to instill a discipline that bordered on emotional starvation. He loved them, but he did not know how to show it outside of the language of ledgers and moral instruction. The ultimate physical manifestation of this tragedy was his failing health. Under the immense stress of running his empire and enduring public hatred, his body began to break down. He developed alopecia, a condition that caused him to lose all his body hair, his eyebrows, his mustache, leaving him with a strange spectral appearance in his later years. More painfully, he suffered from severe digestive ailments, likely stress-induced ulcers, that forced him onto a Spartan diet consisting mainly of milk and simple crackers. The irony was profound and cruel. The man who controlled the world's energy could barely process his own food. He achieved a success so total it became a curse. This marked the dynasty's first great turning point, the moment they shifted from ruthlessly hoarding wealth to strategically giving it all away. Guided by his trusted advisor, Frederick T. Gates, who famously warned him that he must give away his fortune faster than it was accumulating or be crushed by it, Rockefeller began his second career in philanthropy. It was a massive, desperate, and brilliantly strategic campaign to reshape his legacy, to launder his reputation from robber baron to saint. He spent the second half of his long life meticulously giving away the money he had so ruthlessly earned, trying to use his fortune to escape the lonely prison the first half had built. The empire was built, the fortune amassed, but the Rockefeller name was a curse, synonymous with ruthless monopoly and public hatred. The monumental task of sanitizing this legacy, of transforming a robber baron's fortune into a respectable, even noble inheritance, fell to one man, the founder's only son. This is the story of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and his burden of legitimacy. He would spend his entire life attempting to wash the grime from his father's gold, a quest that would lead him into the heart of a national tragedy and force him to pioneer a new form of power. A stained legacy, the massacre, public relations, and a new image. If his father's scandal was the hidden sin of the dynasty, the Ludlow massacre was its public crime, written in the blood of innocent workers. It was the darkest moment in the Rockefellers' industrial history, a tragic turning point that would not only stain the family's name forever, but would forge the entire industry of modern public relations. In the early 20th century, the Rockefeller empire extended beyond oil. The family had invested in numerous industries, including coal mining. They were the largest shareholders in the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, one of the biggest employers in the American West. But the working conditions in CF&I's coal mines were nothing short of hell on earth. Miners toiled in dangerous pits for meager wages and lived in company-owned towns where everything, bait from housing and stores to schools and churches, was under the company's absolute control. They were paid in scrip, a form of currency valid only at overpriced company stores. It was a form of modern-day serfdom. In September 1913, having reached their breaking point, more than 11,000 CF&I miners, led by the United Mine Workers of America, went on strike. Their demands were basic: an 8-hour day, a pay raise, the right to shop where they pleased, and, most importantly, recognition of their union. The response from CF&I, directed from the New York office of John D. Rockefeller Jr., was cold and ruthless. Jr., the founder's devout son, viewed the strike not as a labor issue, but as a moral one. To him, recognizing the union meant surrendering the freedom of a worker to work for whomever he chose, a principle he was willing to defend at any cost. In a famous letter that would come to haunt him, he wrote, "We will protect the rights of the workers, and would rather that we lose every single dollar which we have invested than that they should be deprived of their right to work for whom they please." When the strike began, the company evicted the workers and their families from their company-owned homes. Thousands of people, including women and children, were forced to erect makeshift tent colonies on the frigid Colorado hillsides to survive the winter. The largest of these tent cities was located at a place called Ludlow. The company hired a private army of guards from the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, who were armed with machine guns and a custom-built armored car they nicknamed the Death Special to terrorize the strikers. Tensions escalated for months. Eventually, the governor of Colorado sent in the National Guard to maintain order, but this force, paid in part by the company, largely sided with the interests of the mine owners. The tragedy struck on April 20th, 1914. That morning, a firefight broke out between the National Guard and the strikers. The battle raged all day. As night fell, the National Guard, with support from company guards, advanced on the tent colony and set it on fire. They soaked the tents in kerosene and torched the flimsy shelters. The most horrific discovery was made the next morning. Beneath one of the charred tents in a small cellar that families had dug to escape the bullets, rescuers found the bodies of 2 women and 11 children. They had suffocated or been burned alive. The site became known as the Black Hole of Ludlow. In total, about 20 people, including strike leader Louis Tikas, who had been captured and executed, were killed that day. The massacre ignited a 10-day guerrilla war across the coalfields of Colorado, leading to dozens more deaths. News of the massacre sparked a wave of national outrage. John D. Rockefeller Jr. instantly became the target of public hatred. Newspapers called him a murderer. Protests erupted outside his office at 26 Broadway, with activists wearing mourning bands and carrying signs that read, "Rockefeller Murderer." His image was sullied, and the Rockefeller name, already despised for its monopolistic practices, was now stained with the blood of women and children. This was the dynasty's great turning point in public relations. Facing an unmitigated image disaster, Jr. did something revolutionary. He hired Ivy Lee, a journalist who would later be considered the father of modern public relations. Ivy Lee devised a completely new strategy. Instead of silence or denial, he advised the Rockefellers to proactively tell their side of the story. He issued bulletins, which the union called propaganda and lies, to blame the strikers for the violence. But his more crucial strategy was to humanize the Rockefeller image. Lee convinced Jr. to take a trip to Colorado in 1915. There, Rockefeller Jr., a man known for his rigidity and distance, put on miner's clothes, went down into the mines, listened to grievances, talked with the families, and even danced with the miners' wives at a social gathering. These images were captured by photographers and widely distributed. It was a masterclass in PR. At the same time, the family began to pour vast sums of money into philanthropy more systematically. The Rockefeller Foundation, established a year earlier, began large-scale public health and education campaigns. Though philanthropy existed before, after Ludlow it became an indispensable tool for reshaping public perception, transforming the family's image from robber barons to great benefactors. The Ludlow Massacre remains an indelible tragedy, but it was also a critical turning point. It forced the Rockefeller dynasty to realize that power came not just from money, but from public consent. The lesson from Ludlow was brutal but clear. Power didn't just come from money, it came from conquering public opinion. This realization would define their strategy for the next century. The empire had learned a costly lesson, and that lesson would define its public face for the rest of the 20th century. While John D. Jr. was fighting this public war for the family's soul, a quiet but equally profound battle was being waged within the walls of his own home. This was the rebellion of his wife, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, a struggle that would change the cultural identity of the family forever. Abby came from a world of politics and culture. Her father was Senator Nelson Aldrich, a powerful and cosmopolitan figure. She was a woman of vibrant tastes, intellectual curiosity, and a deep, passionate love for contemporary art. And then she married John D. Rockefeller Jr. Was his father's son in piety and his mother's son in rigidity. He was a man who lived by a strict moral code, who distrusted frivolity, and who saw art primarily through the lens of historical or religious significance. He loved classical art, medieval tapestries, and Chinese ceramics. Their home was a place of austere, almost monastic order. He famously did not drink, smoke, or dance, and he had a deep-seated hatred for modern art, which he saw as ugly, chaotic, and morally suspect. Into this world of quiet, brown-suited discipline, Abby brought color, life, and modernism. Their marriage was a quiet, lifelong clash of worldviews. While he was pouring his energy and fortune into building colonial Williamsburg, a perfect preserved vision of America's past. She was looking to the chaotic, challenging, and vibrant art of the future. She began collecting the works of artists who were then considered radical and even scandalous: Henri Matisse, Pablo Picasso, Vincent van Gogh, Diego Rivera. These were artists who challenged the very notion of order and tradition that her husband held so dear. Her collection grew so large and important that it could no longer be contained within her private rooms, which she called the gallery. This led to her greatest act of rebellion. Along with two other progressive female patrons, Lily P. Bliss and Mary Quinn Sullivan, Abby decided to create something New York City desperately needed: a museum dedicated exclusively to modern art. John D. Jr.'s reaction wasn't just skeptical. By all accounts, he was outright hostile to the idea. He could not understand the value of this strange, abstract art, and he was reluctant to attach the Rockefeller name to an institution that was sure to be controversial and, in his eyes, decadent. He initially refused to give any of the family's money to this project, but Abby was quietly relentless. She used her own personal allowance and inheritance from her father to fund her passion. She fought her own husband, not with anger, but with unshakable persistence, to create what would become one of the family's most celebrated cultural legacies. In 1929, the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, was born. It was Abby's vision, her creation. It was a declaration that the Rockefeller legacy would not only be about oil, banks, and Baptist piety. It would also be about culture, creativity, and the challenging ideas of the modern world. She had single-handedly injected a dose of bohemian radicalism into the heart of America's most conservative dynasty. Her quiet rebellion reached its dramatic climax with the infamous Diego Rivera mural affair. She had championed Rivera, a known communist, to paint a major mural in the lobby of Rockefeller Center, the very symbol of capitalism. When Rivera defiantly included a portrait of Vladimir Lenin in the mural, it created a massive scandal. A furious Nelson Rockefeller, defending the family's honor, had the mural destroyed. The incident deeply pained Abby, but it was the story of her life in miniature. A battle between the rigid world of the Rockefellers and the free, unpredictable world of art she loved. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller's tragedy was that of a vibrant, modern spirit trapped in a family that worshipped the past. But her triumph was that she managed to bend the bars of that cage, not by breaking them, but by filling the space with a beauty and intellectual energy that would forever change the public face of her family. The kingdom had been secured. The family name, once a curse, had been laundered into a symbol of civic virtue through the immense machinery of philanthropy. The third generation, the 5 sons of John D. Jr. and their cousins, known simply as the brothers, were born into a world of unimaginable privilege and even greater expectation. They were not asked to build an empire, but to steward it. But for many of them, this inheritance was a gilded cage, and their lives would be defined by their desperate, creative, and often scandalous attempts to break free. Their rebellions took many forms: geographical, romantic, and ideological. The Heirs, stories of rebellion and tragedy. The first great rebel of his generation was Winthrop Rockefeller, the one they called the Black Sheep. From the very beginning, Winthrop was different. He wasn't bookish or disciplined like his brothers. He was restless, more interested in people than in ledgers. The rigid structure of elite New York society felt less like a birthright and more like a straitjacket. After struggling at Yale, he did the unthinkable. He dropped out and fled. Instead of taking a cushy job at the family office in Rockefeller Center, he went to the Texas oil fields, the very source of his family's fortune, and took a job as a common laborer, a roughneck. Imagine a Rockefeller choosing sweat and grime over a corner office. It wasn't just unusual, it was a direct rejection of everything his name stood for. He wanted to be judged not by his last name, but by the work of his own two hands. After serving with distinction in World War II, where he was wounded in a kamikaze attack, he returned to New York, but the city no longer fit. A messy and very public divorce from a glamorous socialite became tabloid fodder, deeply embarrassing the private Rockefeller family. Adrift and unhappy, Winthrop needed a final permanent escape. He found it in the most unlikely of places, Arkansas. In 1953, he moved to one of the poorest and least developed states in the nation. To the New York elite, it was the middle of nowhere. For Winthrop, it was a blank canvas. He established Winrock Farms, a model cattle ranch that would revolutionize agriculture in the state. Here, far from the judgment of his family, he reinvented himself. He wasn't the failed Rockefeller anymore. He was just Win, a man who drove his own pickup truck and invested his own money into building schools and medical clinics for neglected communities. His greatest act of rebellion was yet to come. Arkansas was a bastion of the Democratic Party, a state still grappling with the ugly legacy of racial segregation. Winthrop, a moderate Republican with a progressive heart, entered politics. In 1966, he won a stunning victory and became the first Republican governor of Arkansas in nearly a century. And as governor, he didn't just lead, he transformed the state. He quietly but firmly pushed for racial integration, appointed the first black members to state boards in Arkansas history, and reformed the state's notoriously brutal prison system. Winthrop's rebellion wasn't destructive, it was creative. He proved that a Rockefeller's influence didn't have to be confined to the boardrooms of Wall Street. He remade the family legacy on his own terms, far from the long shadow of Rockefeller Center. If Winthrop's rebellion was geographical, his nephew Stephen Clark Rockefeller's was one of the heart. The eldest son of the powerful and ambitious Nelson Rockefeller, Stephen staged a rebellion that was quieter, but in some ways even more scandalous to the family's rigid code. The 1950s were an era of conformity, and for the Rockefellers, marriages were often strategic alliances, uniting them with other powerful families. A suitable background was non-negotiable. Into this carefully ordered world walked Anne-Marie Rasmussen. She was everything a future Mrs. Rockefeller was not supposed to be. Born in humble circumstances in Norway, her father was a janitor. She came to America seeking adventure. In 1957, her new position was as a maid in the sprawling Fifth Avenue apartment of Nelson Rockefeller. It was there she met Stephen, a thoughtful and sensitive young man studying philosophy and theology at Princeton. A secret romance began to blossom, a relationship that crossed an unbridgeable chasm of class and social standing. In 1959, Stephen did something that sent shock waves through the Rockefeller dynasty. He announced his intention to marry Anne-Marie. The press exploded. It was a real-life Cinderella story, and the world was enchanted. But inside the Rockefeller clan, the reaction was reportedly far more complicated. A Rockefeller marrying the help? It was a breach of protocol so profound that it was almost unthinkable. Nelson, ever the politician, was particularly worried about how it might affect his future presidential ambitions. But Stephen, in his quiet, determined way, held firm. He refused to bow to the immense pressure of family tradition. They were married in a small church in Norway, in a ceremony that became a global media event. For his part, Stephen continued on his unconventional path, becoming a respected professor of religion and philosophy, seeking a wealth of ideas rather than of capital. Though the fairy tale marriage eventually ended in divorce, strained by the immense pressure of their different worlds, Stephen's rebellion was significant. He had challenged the very definition of what a Rockefeller was supposed to be, choosing personal love over dynastic expectation. As the 20th century wore on, the rebellions became more ideological, with heirs questioning the very political and economic systems that had created their fortune. The most prominent political rebel was John D.J. Rockefeller IV. The great-grandson of the founder, he was expected to follow the family's moderate Republican path. Instead, after joining the Vista Volunteer Program and being sent to the impoverished coal mining community of Emmons, West Virginia, his worldview was transformed. Witnessing the struggles of the miners, he abandoned his party and became a fervent Democrat. He would go on to build a long and powerful political career as the governor and then 5-term U.S. Senator for West Virginia. He used the prestige and resources of the Rockefeller name to champion causes like miner safety, children's health care, and social welfare programs, using the power of a capitalist icon to serve the Party of Labor. An even more shocking ideological challenge came from Jay's cousin, Sandra Rockefeller Ferry, the daughter of the establishment icon John D. III. In the turbulent 1960s, a time of profound cultural and political upheaval, Sandra married John Ferry, a vocal anti-war activist and an avowed democratic socialist. This marriage brought the era's most radical critiques of capitalism, wealth, and American foreign policy directly into the family's inner sanctum. Her father, the ultimate diplomat who built cultural bridges with world leaders, now had a son-in-law who was ideologically opposed to the very foundations of the family's power. It was the ultimate test of the dynasty's ability to adapt, proving that no wall, not even one built by Rockefeller money, could keep out the revolutionary ideas of a changing world. For every heir who found a way to rebel against the Rockefeller name by fleeing to a new land, marrying for love, or adopting a rival ideology, there were others who were simply consumed by it. For them, the great inheritance was not a cage to be escaped, but a weight that became too heavy to bear. Their stories are not of defiance, but of sorrow. These are the chronicles of the great tragedies that befell the inheritors, of mysterious disappearances, shocking accidents, psychological anguish, and curses that seem to bleed down through the generations, proving that the family's immense fortune was no shield against the profoundest forms of human suffering. The Inheritors, a legacy of tragedy. Of all the tragedies that have befallen the Rockefeller dynasty, none is more iconic or more haunting than the story of Michael Clark Rockefeller. It is a story that strips away the veneer of wealth and power to reveal a fundamental, terrifying truth, that in the face of the world's ancient mysteries, even the greatest of modern empires is rendered utterly helpless. Michael's story begins as a quiet rebellion. He was the youngest son of Nelson Rockefeller, a man whose entire being was geared towards ambition, politics, and the acquisition of public power. Michael was the opposite. He was a sensitive, introspective, and artistic soul. Where his father saw the world as a chessboard of influence to be conquered, Michael saw it as a museum of wonders to be understood. He was repulsed by the sterile, predictable world of New York high society and the cold machinery of finance. He was searching for something authentic, something visceral, something real, everything his own world was not. After graduating with honors from Harvard, he found his calling in the powerful expressive art of indigenous cultures. This passion led him, in 1961, to one of the last truly unexplored frontiers on the planet, the labyrinthine swamps of southwestern New Guinea, the home of the Asmat people. This was not a casual trip. This was a pilgrimage into another reality. The Asmat lived in a world governed not by clocks and ledgers, but by spirits, rituals, and an ancient, brutal logic. Their landscape was a disorienting realm of mud, mangrove, and disease. They were master artists carving breathtakingly intricate shields and towering ancestor poles called bish. But their art was inextricably linked to their spirituality, which was in turn linked to violence. They were fierce warriors, and their culture was steeped in the cycles of headhunting and ritual cannibalism, not as acts of savage hunger, but as a sacred means of absorbing an enemy's power and restoring cosmic balance. Michael was not a thrill seeker looking for danger. He was a genuine scholar captivated by the raw power of the Asmat worldview. He learned their language, respected their customs, and hoped to preserve their art before it vanished. He was a man from the world of steel and concrete, willingly stepping into a world of spirit and blood. On November 17, 1961, that collision of worlds reached its tipping point. Michael and a Dutch anthropologist, René Wassing, were navigating the treacherous mouth of the Eilanden River. Their vessel, a flimsy, overloaded catamaran, was no match for the violent currents where the river meets the Arafura Sea. A wave swamped the boat, and its engine died. They were cast adrift, two men from the modern world suddenly insignificant against the immense indifferent power of the ocean. For hours, they clung to the overturned hull, drifting farther out to sea. As dawn broke, the shore was a faint, taunting line on the horizon. It was then that Michael, aged 23, made the decision that would seal his fate. He stripped down, strapped 2 empty gasoline cans to his belt for buoyancy, and turned to Wassing. His last words have become legend, a perfect tragic echo of his upbringing. "I think I can make it." Was it Rockefeller confidence? The ingrained belief that will and determination can conquer any obstacle? Or was it the hubris of a young man who had never truly faced a problem that couldn't be solved by his family's name or fortune? We will never know. He slipped into the churning water and began the long, desperate swim toward a shore that held dangers far greater than the sea itself. He was never seen again. The disappearance of a Rockefeller heir triggered an unprecedented response. Nelson Rockefeller, a man accustomed to bending the world to his will, was now just a frantic father, consumed by grief and desperation. He flew to New Guinea, bringing the full cacophony of modern power into this primal landscape. Helicopters whirred over ancient swamps. Naval ships patrolled the coastline. The Dutch and Australian governments mobilized their forces. They scoured the coastline, the rivers, and the sea for any trace of the lost son. But the jungle remained silent. The modern world's technology was useless against the endless mud and the impenetrable mangroves. After 9 agonizing days, a heartbroken Nelson was forced to accept the unthinkable. The official conclusion was announced. Michael had drowned. But this clean, simple explanation never sat right. It couldn't account for the complete absence of any evidence. Not a body, not a piece of clothing, not one of the gas cans. A darker, more terrifying theory began to circulate in whispers, a theory the family refused to acknowledge for decades. This theory was brought into stark, persuasive light in 2014 by journalist Carl Hoffman's book Savage Harvest. Hoffman's investigation suggested that Michael did make it to shore, exhausted and vulnerable, only to stumble into a cycle of ritual violence he could never have understood. Just a few years prior, a Dutch colonial patrol had killed several warriors from a nearby village, Otchenep. In the Asmat worldview, this created a cosmic imbalance, a blood debt that had to be repaid. Hoffman documented oral histories passed down through generations, stories of a white man, a man from the white tribe, who emerged from the sea at the wrong place at the very wrong time. According to these accounts, Michael Rockefeller was not killed out of random savagery. He was killed to restore balance. He became an unwitting pawn in a tribal conflict, his death a sacred act of reciprocal violence. While the ultimate truth remains buried in the swamps of New Guinea, the possibility of this horrifying end is what makes Michael's story so profoundly tragic. It wasn't just a death, it was a complete and total negation of his identity. He wasn't Michael Rockefeller, heir to a global empire. In his final moments, he was just a symbol, an anonymous representative of an outside world, consumed by a culture he had sought only to understand. His disappearance left a permanent gaping wound in the family. It became their great haunting myth, a constant gnawing reminder of the absolute limits of their power. The world's richest and most influential family was utterly helpless, unable to find or save their son, or even to know for certain his final fate. The mystery of Michael Rockefeller is the ultimate Rockefeller tragedy, a story of a son who sought escape from the world of his father, only to vanish into another, far more ancient and unforgiving world. Decades after the world's most powerful family was brought to its knees by the indifferent waters of New Guinea, the specter of sudden tragic loss would visit them again. It was a modern echo of Michael's fate, a different kind of accident, but one that carried the same brutal message, that the Rockefeller name, for all its power, offered no shield against the brutal randomness of fate. This is the story of Richard Gilded Rockefeller and the cruelest of ironies. Richard, the son of the family's ultimate patriarch, David Rockefeller Sr., represented a different kind of heir. In a family defined by global finance and political ambition, Richard chose a life of quiet service. He became a physician, a family doctor in Maine, a man dedicated to the tangible one-on-one act of healing. He poured his energy into humanitarian work, most notably as a longtime chairman for the U.S. Advisory Board of Doctors Without Borders, an organization that runs toward the world's worst disasters. His life was a quiet descent from the abstract, globe-spanning power his father wielded from the top floor of the Chase Manhattan Bank. While David Sr. dealt with currencies, nations, and systems, Richard dealt with patients, diseases, and communities. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of the family's philanthropic mission brought down to its most human level, a life dedicated not to accumulating power, but to preserving life. This is what makes the timing of his death so profoundly tragic. On June 12, 2014, the Rockefeller clan gathered to celebrate an almost impossible milestone, the 99th birthday of David Rockefeller Sr. It was a celebration not just of a man, but of an era, a testament to the incredible longevity and endurance of the Titan who seemed to have conquered time itself. Richard, a devoted son, was there to honor his father. The next morning, on Friday, June 13th, the 65-year-old Richard prepared to fly home. An experienced pilot, he was piloting his own small single-engine plane, a Piper Meridian. It was a detail that spoke to his character, hands-on, self-reliant, not a man to be chauffeured through life. He took off from Westchester County Airport, just a few miles from the family's legendary Pocantico Hills estate. The weather was poor. A dense fog and driving rain had shrouded the landscape, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Minutes after takeoff, the plane disappeared from radar. Air traffic controllers tried frantically to make contact, but there was only silence. Soon after, the wreckage was found in a stand of trees just west of the airport. Richard Gilded Rockefeller had been killed instantly. His death was not a mystery like Michael's, nor a scandal like Nelson's. It was a pure, unadulterated tragedy. and its purity is what makes it so sharp and painful. There was no villain, no moral failing, no dark secret to uncover. There was only a dedicated doctor flying home to his family, a patch of bad weather, and a fatal miscalculation. It was a story of simple, irreversible physics. But the timing of his death was a cruel twist of fate. He died returning from a celebration of his father's near-centurial life, a life so long it seemed to defy mortal limits. The son's life was extinguished, just as he had honored the father's extraordinary endurance. The parallel to his cousin Michael was inescapable. Both were sons of the dynasty's most powerful titans. Both chose lives of purpose away from the family's traditional centers of power, and both met their end in a fatal encounter with the elements, one consumed by the sea, the other by the fog-shrouded sky. It was as if the universe had to periodically remind the Rockefellers that while they may have mastered the world of men, they were powerless against the forces of nature. While the world knew of the great public tragedies of the Rockefeller dynasty, the battles with governments, the lost sons, the public scandals, one of its darkest chapters unfolded far from the headlines in a less publicized branch of the family. This is not a story of a single tragic accident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It is a story so bleak, so relentless in its sorrow, it suggests something more sinister than tragedy, a poison in the bloodline, passed down from one generation to the next. This was the family of Winifred Rockefeller Emeny, a granddaughter of John D. Sr.'s brother, William. This isn't just a story about sadness, it's a chilling chronicle of how one family branch simply collapsed from the inside out, proving that no amount of money can save you from the darkness within your own mind. To understand this tragedy, we must first understand the unique prison of dynastic wealth. Winifred lived a life of immense, almost unimaginable privilege. Her world was one of sprawling country estates in Greenwich, lavish Park Avenue apartments, and exclusive social circles. She was married to a respected academic, Brooks Emeny, the president of the esteemed Council on Foreign Relations. On paper, her life was a flawless portrait of high society success, a perfect continuation of the Rockefeller mandate for excellence and influence. But this world was a gilded cage, and its bars were forged from expectation and isolation. Throughout her life, Winifred was plagued by what was then politely dismissed as melancholy or nervous ailments. Today, we would recognize it as severe chronic mental illness. In an era that misunderstood and stigmatized such conditions, especially among the elite, where any sign of weakness was a profound taboo, her suffering was likely a deeply private and lonely affair. The very name Rockefeller, which demanded an image of strength and flawless control, would have made seeking genuine help almost impossible. Her immense wealth didn't buy her better care, it bought her a more luxurious isolation, surrounding her with people who likely could not comprehend a sorrow that money couldn't fix. But the true horror of her story lies not just with her own struggles. It lies in the terrifying possibility that this internal darkness was an inheritance, a genetic and psychological legacy passed to her children, where it would fester and finally erupt with devastating force. The first blow struck in the autumn of 1949, and it was a direct assault on the Rockefeller promise of a perfect future. Her 22-year-old daughter, Elizabeth Emeny, was the very picture of that promise. A bright, popular student at Vassar College, she was poised to take her place in the world, armed with a prestigious education and an immense inheritance. But the gilded cage had been her home, too. The pressure to live up to the family name, the subtle but immense weight of expectation, and the inherited shadow of her mother's melancholy proved to be an unbearable combination. On a cool October day, in her off-campus apartment, Elizabeth took her own life. The suicide of a young, promising heir was a quiet shock to their social circle, a terrible and inexplicable tragedy that shattered the illusion of the perfect family. The Rockefellers, a family that could control so much, were devastated. But the tragedy was only beginning. It was not an isolated event. It was the first domino to fall. Less than a year later, in the summer of 1950, the second blow fell, and this one was even more shocking. Her 25-year-old son, Henry Emeny, was a charismatic and handsome Marine veteran. He had served his country in the war and returned, seemingly a model of masculine strength and duty, the very image of a resilient male heir. But the war, or perhaps the family's own internal darkness, had left him with wounds no one could see. One day he was found in the garage of his Greenwich home. He had attached a hose to his car's exhaust pipe. He, too, had taken his own life. With Henry's death, the story moved beyond tragedy into the realm of a palpable curse. For a mother to lose two of her adult children to the same silent killer, suicide, in the span of 10 months is an agony that defies words. The great Rockefeller fortune, which could build cities and eradicate diseases, seemed haunted. The press reported the deaths with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. The family, which prized privacy and control above all else, was now exposed in its most vulnerable and broken state. The wave of self-destruction consuming Winifred's children was a force that no amount of power or influence could stop. For Winifred, the loss of both her children was a grief so absolute it became a gravitational force, pulling her own fragile mental state into an inescapable abyss. Imagine the silence in those vast empty rooms on Park Avenue. Imagine a mother left alone with the knowledge that the darkness inside her had seemingly consumed her children. Who could she talk to? Who could possibly understand? Her wealth made her more isolated, not less. The world saw her as a Rockefeller, a figure of immense fortune. She saw herself as a failed mother whose children had succumbed to a darkness she couldn't fight. The money was not a comfort. It was a mockery. The final act of this family tragedy came on a summer day in June of 1951, just a year after her son's death. Winifred Rockefeller Emeny, age 47, was in her 7th-floor apartment on Park Avenue, one of the most prestigious addresses in the world. From that height, she could look down upon a city that her family's name had helped to build. But from that height, she could find no reason to continue. She walked to the window, and she jumped. Her death was the final devastating act in this family's tragedy. And in a strange way, it was a mercy, because it finally brought the story to an end. The story of Winifred and her children is one of the most powerful and terrifying cautionary tales of the American aristocracy. It is a chronicle that powerfully suggests that the immense pressure and isolation of the Rockefeller world, perhaps combined with a genetic predisposition to depression, could create a sorrow that no fortune could ever cure. The money provided no comfort. Instead, it may have amplified their private pain, creating a world so rarefied and empty that escape for 3 members of one family seemed impossible. This saga is one of the darkest, most hidden chapters in the Rockefeller history. It is a shocking reminder that the most terrible tragedies are often the ones that have no clear villain, only silent victims consumed by a darkness that no amount of gold could ever illuminate. Not all tragedies were as violent or sudden. Some were quiet, lifelong struggles against the psychological weight of the name itself. John D. Rockefeller III, the perfect son, lived out such a tragedy. He was the embodiment of the Rockefeller Code: discipline, duty, and unimpeachable dignity. But his private life was a quiet wasteland of emotional desolation. Raised to be an institution rather than a man, he was pathologically shy and incapable of expressing affection. His marriage to the brilliant Blanchette Hooker Rockefeller became a gilded cage of profound loneliness for her. The emotional chasm between them grew so vast that, in the 1950s, they secretly decided to separate. The emotional toll of this decision proved too much for Blanchette, who suffered a complete nervous breakdown and was quietly hospitalized. Though they later reconciled, the story reveals the immense hidden price of perfection. The final irony? This man who lived his entire life by a code of perfect order was killed instantly in a moment of pure, random chaos, a 3-car pileup. This internal struggle was articulated most clearly by a later generation. Eileen Rockefeller, daughter of David Sr., bravely exposed the psychological toll in her memoir, Being a Rockefeller, Becoming Myself. She wrote of the golden burden, the crushing loneliness, the pressure to be perfect, and the crisis of trying to forge a personal identity when the world already has one assigned to you. Her life's work became a form of healing as she pioneered emotional philanthropy, founding organizations to promote the very social and emotional skills her family's rigid, duty-bound world often lacked. Her story is the tragedy of the modern heir, a battle not for wealth or power, but for the self. As the 20th century marched toward its conclusion, the world that the Rockefellers had built and mastered began to fracture. The great centralized power of the American establishment, of which they were the architects, started to give way to a more chaotic, decentralized, and unpredictable global landscape. The final chapters of the great Rockefeller brothers weren't about building an empire. They were about watching that empire slowly and inevitably fade away. They are tales of unconventional quests, shocking stumbles, and the quiet, lonely twilight of the gods. End of an era, the final brothers, scandals, and a fading empire. Not all the shocking stories in the Rockefeller clan are tales of tragedy. Some are tales of a rebellion so strange, so unexpected it challenges our very perception of what a Rockefeller is. This is the story of Lawrence Rockefeller and his secret, lifelong quest for UFOs. To the public, Lawrence was the most forward-thinking and perhaps most rational of the brothers. He was the visionary venture capitalist who invested early in companies that would change the world, like Apple and Intel. He was also the great conservationist, using his fortune to preserve vast tracts of natural beauty across America. He was a man of science, progress, and tangible results. But in private, Lawrence was driven by a passion that was a world away from boardrooms and national parks. He was deeply fascinated by the paranormal, spirituality, and, above all, the phenomenon of unidentified flying objects. This was not a passing hobby. It was a serious, decades-long intellectual and financial investment. While his brothers were meeting with heads of state and captains of industry, Lawrence was funding research by the world's leading UFO investigators. He provided critical support to figures like Dr. John Mack, a Pulitzer Prize-winning Harvard psychiatrist who controversially studied the experiences of people who claimed to have been abducted by aliens. Lawrence believed that the phenomenon was real and deserved rigorous scientific study, free from ridicule. His quest went beyond mere funding. He used the full weight of his name and influence to push for official government disclosure of UFO information. In the 1990s, he spearheaded what became known as the Rockefeller Initiative. He personally approached the Clinton White House, using his connections to advocate for the declassification of all government files related to UFOs, particularly the infamous Roswell incident. He compiled a comprehensive briefing book called The Best Available Evidence and sent it to top officials, hoping to force the issue into the open. This quest was, in its own way, a profound rebellion. It was a rebellion against the strict scientific materialism that had defined his world. In an empire built on the tangible assets of oil, stocks, and land, Lawrence spent his capital in search of the intangible, the unexplained, the otherworldly. While the family name was a symbol of earthly power, he was using that power to look to the stars. For nearly a century, the Rockefeller name was synonymous with financial genius. The family projected an aura of infallibility. This was the crushing weight of expectation that fell upon David Rockefeller Jr., son of the legendary banker. In the 1980s, he embarked on an ambitious project that was meant to be his legacy. The project was called Sail Rock, a grand vision for a luxurious resort on the shores of South Caicos. It was a classic Rockefeller undertaking, ambitious and large-scale, but the dream quickly collapsed into a nightmare. Plagued by mismanagement and cost overruns, the project collapsed. In 1987, the development company filed for bankruptcy, leaving a trail of debt and unfinished construction. The failure became a public embarrassment, a rare spectacle of a Rockefeller business venture going belly up. It was the shocking moment that proved the Rockefeller Midas touch was not hereditary. It was a different kind of Rockefeller tragedy, not of death, but of ambition and failure. It humanized the next generation by showing their vulnerability in the very arena where their ancestors were gods. The father who lost his son to a mystery would see his own life end in a scandal that left the world with nothing but questions. Nelson Rockefeller's life was a testament to boundless ambition and monumental public achievement. He was the most vibrant, charismatic, and relentlessly driven of his generation, a force of nature who lived his entire life on a public stage, constantly performing, building, and striving for the ultimate prize. But his end was a private disaster, an undignified final act that would forever tarnish his legacy and reveal the fragile human being behind the titan. To appreciate the fall, one must first understand the height. Nelson was a colossus. For 4 consecutive terms, he was the powerful and progressive governor of New York, a builder who reshaped the state's infrastructure and championed the arts with an infectious energy. He ran for president 3 times, the great prize that always eluded him, but he finally reached the pinnacle of federal power when President Gerald Ford appointed him vice president of the United States. His entire life seemed to be one long, seamless performance, designed to project nothing but power and control. He was the Rockefeller who thrived in the spotlight, a man who seemed to have mastered the art of public image. It is fitting, then, that his family first tried to write a perfect final scene for him. On the night of January 26, 1979, the first announcement of his death was issued. A family spokesman stated that Nelson Rockefeller, age 70, had died of a massive heart attack while working late at his desk in his office in Rockefeller Center. It was a noble, almost Roman end for a tireless public servant, dying at his desk at the very heart of his family's empire. A perfect story, except it was a lie. It was the ending his entire life had been written to deserve, but the story, so perfectly crafted, began to fall apart almost immediately. Journalists, spurred by the post-Watergate era of skepticism, started asking questions. The timeline seemed off. There were inconsistencies. Then the first crack in the official narrative appeared. The 911 call that had summoned help hadn't come from his famous Midtown office. It had come from a different address, a far more discreet townhouse on West 54th Street, a property Nelson owned but that few knew about. And he had not been alone. The press soon discovered the shocking truth. Nelson Rockefeller had died in the company of a 25-year-old female aide named Megan Marshak. The story of the statesman working late at his desk was a complete fabrication, a lie concocted in a moment of panic to protect the family's carefully guarded image. The revelation ignited a media firestorm. The carefully constructed image of Nelson Rockefeller, the dignified elder statesman, shattered overnight. The story turned from a respectable tragedy into a sordid scandal. The questions were immediate and lurid. What was a 70-year-old married man doing late at night in a private townhouse with an assistant nearly 50 years his junior? The tabloids had a field day, with headlines winking at the scandalous possibilities. Comedians on late-night television began joking that the former vice president had died of causes that were anything but natural. The family's attempts at damage control, so masterful in previous generations, only made things worse. Their spokesman, Hugh Morrow, was forced to retract and revise the official story multiple times, each new version adding to the sense of a clumsy and desperate cover-up. With each new version of the story, the truth became harder to find, leaving a void that was quickly filled by rumor and speculation. The most damning questions remained unanswered, fueling the controversy. Why was there a nearly 1 hour delay between the time Rockefeller collapsed and the time the 911 call was finally made? It was revealed that Marshak had first called a friend, a news reporter, who then came to the townhouse before an ambulance was summoned. Why the fatal delay? Was there a panic? An attempt to hide something or someone? The full story of what happened in that room has never been told. Megan Marshak, the only other witness, has maintained a lifelong public silence on the matter, leaving a permanent void at the center of the story. Nelson's death became a landmark moment in the relationship between the press and public figures. The old unspoken pact of deference was gone. The private lives of the powerful were now considered fair game, and the bungled cover-up of Nelson's death emboldened the media to dig deeper into the personal affairs of politicians for decades to come. For the Rockefeller family, it was a profound humiliation. A dynasty that prized privacy and control above all else had its most intimate and embarrassing secrets laid bare for the world to see. A life of immense public achievement, of building universities, museums, and highways, was suddenly in danger of being defined by its final, undignified moments. A man so obsessed with his public legacy, who had controlled every aspect of his image for 50 years, lost control completely in his final hour. It was a deeply human end to a life lived on a superhuman scale. It revealed that behind the armor of power and prestige was a man as fallible and vulnerable as any other. This was the final crucial turning point, the moment the Rockefeller mystique finally cracked under public scrutiny, ushering in a new media age where no secret was safe and no titan was too big to fall. The final great story of the 20th century Rockefellers belongs to the last of the brothers, the man who outlived them all, David Rockefeller, for some. His life was not a drama of scandalous rebellion or sudden violent tragedy. His was a quieter, more profound tragedy, the tragedy of a king who did not lose his throne in a battle, but simply lived long enough to watch his entire kingdom fade into memory around him. David was the youngest, the brightest, and the one who most purely inherited his grandfather's global vision. While John D. Sr. conquered the world of oil, David conquered the world of international finance. As the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, he was far more than a banker. He was the unofficial foreign minister of American capitalism, a statesman without portfolio. His legendary Rolodex, said to contain over 150,000 contacts, was a symbol of his power. He could convene a meeting with virtually any head of state, corporate titan, or revolutionary leader on earth. from Nikita Khrushchev in the Kremlin to Deng Xiaoping in Beijing. He was a man perfectly built for the 20th century. He was raised to believe in, and ultimately to lead, the establishment, a network of powerful, like-minded men from business, government, and academia who believed they could, through quiet consensus in paneled boardrooms and private clubs, guide the world toward peace and prosperity. For decades, this worldview worked. He was arguably the most powerful private citizen on earth, a man who operated on a level that transcended national politics. But as he grew older, the world began to change in ways he could not control. The very foundations of his power began to erode. The era of the powerful centralized establishment, built on trust in institutions and elite leadership, began to crumble. The rise of Silicon Valley created a new kind of decentralized, anti-authoritarian wealth and power that had little use for the old gatekeepers of Wall Street. More profoundly, the internet and social media fueled populist movements on both the left and the right that were actively hostile to his entire worldview. The very things he believed in, global cooperation, elite consensus, international banking, became the targets of widespread conspiracy and suspicion. Figures like David Rockefeller were no longer seen as wise statesmen, but as sinister puppet masters of a new world order. The world began to speak a new language of disruptive technology and populist rage, a language that was utterly foreign to the quiet, diplomatic tongue of the establishment. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the relentless pace of globalization, the 2008 financial crisis, all of these events reshaped the world, leaving his brand of gentlemanly top-down capitalism looking like a relic. He, the great internationalist, lived to see the rise of nationalism and protectionism. He, the symbol of banking power, lived to see a world that deeply distrusted Wall Street. It was as if he were the last king of a great empire, standing on his castle walls, watching a new, unrecognizable civilization being built in the fields beyond, one whose rules he did not make and did not understand. This external obsolescence was mirrored by a profound and quiet personal loss. He embarked on a long, lonely vigil as he watched his entire generation disappear. He outlived them all. He watched his brothers, the only other men on earth who truly understood the strange, rarefied world they inhabited, pass away one by one. Winthrop in 1973, John D. III in 1978, Nelson in 1979, and finally Lawrence in 2004. With each funeral, he became more of a lonely survivor, the sole guardian of their generation's collective memory, the last king of a fading dynasty. The final cruel blow came in 2014. Just one day after celebrating his 99th birthday, his son, Richard Rockefeller, was killed in a plane crash. For a man who had lived for nearly a century, who had outlived all his siblings, the loss of a child was the ultimate violation of the natural order he so cherished. It was a final, brutal reminder of the family's vulnerability to the random chaos of the world. David Rockefeller's tragedy wasn't failure. In fact, he succeeded brilliantly. His tragedy was that he simply lived too long. He did everything he was supposed to do, and he did it brilliantly. But he could not stop the relentless march of history. His long life became a final, lonely salute to the American century and the central commanding role his family had played in it. He lived to be 101, a man built for the 20th century, waking up to find himself a stranger in the 21st, a living monument to a world that had vanished. His death in 2017 did not just mark the end of a life, it marked the end of an era. It was the quiet, final closing of the book on the Rockefeller Empire as the world knew it, the last whisper from a time when a handful of great men truly believed they could and did shape the destiny of the globe. In the end, the history of the Rockefellers isn't a story about money. It's a story about what money costs, the price paid in shame, blood, and the human soul. It is the saga of an empire built from shame, laundered by calculated generosity, and ultimately transformed into a golden burden for its heirs. They conquered the world of industry and finance, but they could not conquer their own inner turmoil. Perhaps the dynasty's greatest tragedy wasn't a single scandal or death. It was the internal war each of them fought between power and their own humanity. And in the end, it was a war that none of them truly won. But the echo hasn't faded. The empire's money, institutions, and controversies are still with us, now facing the challenges of a new generation. The story of the Rockefellers continues even after the great kings are gone. Should we make part 3? Tell me in the comments if you want to explore the modern Rockefellers and what you would be most interested in seeing.